Episode 6 of Season 3 of Invincible is, in my opinion, one of, if not the best episodes of the series that I've seen so far. This episode features Scott Duvall, otherwise known as Powerplex, making his debut and is one of the most tragic characters in the series. Powerplex has a deep, burning hatred for Mark Grayson, so much so that he dedicates his entire existence to destroying Mark, who had inadvertently affected Powerplex's life before Mark even knew who he was. This performance is truly, excuse the pun, amplified by the voice actor Aaron Paul, best known for his work as Jesse Pinkman in Breaking Bad. You can really hear the emotional turmoil this character's going through, and Aaron gave a tremendous performance. Now, Invincible has been somewhat of our bread and butter series over the years, so if you're new around here, feel free to check out our other comprehensive videos on the biggest characters in the series that have debuted in the show already. After all, there's other channels that do it, but we do it best here at So today I bring you the complete history of the electrifying Scott Duvall, also known as Powerplex. Powerplex made his comic book debut in Invincible issue number 59, written by Robert Kirkman and drawn by Ryan Ottley. But before we get into his first appearance, I want to discuss one of the most infamous battles in Invincible history, Mark vs. Omni-Man 1. This was a standout battle within the series, but was really ramped up by the performance in the show and helped catapult Invincible to a mega franchise. It was brutal and caused a tremendous amount of collateral damage in the Invincible universe. This battle caused a lot of death at the hands of two of the most powerful beings on Earth, innocent bystanders who had absolutely nothing to do with the conflict. One of those bystanders was named Jennifer Duvall, the sister of Scott Duvall, who died when a building collapsed during Mark and Nolan's battle. The damage was so extensive that they never even found her body. Scott is first seen practicing a speech in front of his wife, Becky. This speech is planned to be delivered to Mark Grayson after Powerplex's subsequent victory over him. His wife giving him the old, "It's a very good speech, you're such a big boy" type nod of approval. We learn that Scott isn't actually a hero. He was a lab worker at the Pentagon who steals experimental biothermal discs in order to create a suit capable of channeling a low level of thermal energy control that Scott naturally has, and unleashing it as a blast of energy. Ultimately, the technology that Scott steals is highly valuable and extremely easy to trace, as only Scott and a handful of other scientists have access to it. And look at his face. This man looks guilty as hell. Scott initially tries to lure Invincible out by causing a minor disturbance in a public place, but instead of Invincible, it's Shapesmith who shows up. Powerplex demands Invincible, and Shapesmith taunts him by turning into Mark, which prompts Scott to blow up some cars in his face and flee the scene. Back at home, Scott is obviously agitated that he couldn't get Invincible's attention, and his wife complains that Scott didn't involve her when he tried to lure out Mark, as she wanted to be there when Scott takes down Invincible once and for all, considering she's just as emotionally invested as he is, kind of. Seems like a stupid idea if you're me to, show up to where superheroes are fighting, but hey, what do I know? Do you guys hear that? It sounds like foreshadowing. Scott next has another minor run-in with the teen team, who he's able to kind of defeat/escape from, but ultimately still no showdown with Invincible. At this point, a few weeks has gone by, and Scott begins to kind of lose it at home. He's coming completely unhinged. Scott and his wife cook up a new plan to lure Invincible out by using his wife and their infant child Jack as bait, cooking up a story that they were kidnapped in an abandoned weapons facility. I hope you can kind of see where this is going, because it's about to get very dark from here, ladies and gentlemen. Mark takes the bait and arrives at the facility, and Powerplex confronts him, questioning him about his sister, who Mark doesn't seem to recall but profusely apologizes for the death of. That is not good enough for Powerplex, who goes on the assault, and Mark starts to realize that the more he attacks him, the stronger Powerplex becomes. Mark deduces that the biothermal discs are storing the kinetic energy of his blows and only making Powerplex stronger. Mark effectively decides that he's had enough of this entire situation and goes to simply save the wife and child and leave, but in the process gets spit on in his face by Scott's wife Becky. Subsequently starts to assume that the entire situation is possibly a setup for revenge, which it is. Scott attempts to end the battle by releasing all of his pent-up excess energy as one massive blast at Mark. an out-of-control rage blast, but the electricity branches off, hits Scott's wife and son, instantly killing them. Powerplex loses it at the sight of his now deceased wife and child, but Mark is able to stop him by simply holding him tightly. Powerplex is fueled off of all types of energy, including the kinetic energy of strikes, so holding him tightly essentially renders him harmless. Scott is sent to a CIA prison under the Pentagon, where Mark attempts to speak with him before Scott reaffirms his undying pledge to end Mark's life. If that wasn't horrible enough, the very next issue, the Invincible War begins, and Mark is attacked by dozens of multiversal Mark Graysons. During the attack on the planet, Scott is broken out of prison while Mark is nearby, and he could attack, but chooses to help the other heroes battling the interdimensional Mark Grayson squad. In the next issue, following the battle, Mark is at Adam Eve's bedside but returns to the wreckage to help the Guardians and Cecil with their cleanup efforts. There, he encounters Powerplex, who immediately attacks him, questioning how he could show his face after the horrible atrocities his otherworldly doppelgangers committed. Powerplex is ultimately stopped here by Youngblood member Badrock pinning him down. Weird crossover too. People always ask about Spawn and Witchblade, Youngblood showing up in the Invincible War, and it's never really explained, ever. Scott isn't seen again for about 20 issues from this point. During the time between these events, Powerplex had been allowed to join a group of heroes called the Actioneers after completing a tremendous amount of GDA-sponsored therapy. Actioneers is a terrible name, by the way. He's featured briefly in Invincible Universe issue 2 during the battle that Titan has with the criminal underworld entities known as the Order, specifically Lou, the giant dragon, but he's a very minor background character. However, back in the main Invincible series, a few issues later, a villain named Dinosaurus turns Las Vegas into a sheet of glass through a series of massive explosions. This is just another of the horrific things that Mark ends up blaming himself for, but ultimately only fuels the semi-reformed Powerplex's hatred of our favorite Viltrumite. Regardless, the news of this devastation sets Powerplex off. Powerplex waits for Mark to be spotted near the GDC and swoops in and attacks him while he's unsuspecting. Mark attempts to explain the rationale behind the unfortunate reality of the casualties in the Las Vegas event, but he tells him that despite so much death occurring, if Mark wasn't there to stop these threats, they would have been so much worse. Powerplex attacks, but Mark refuses to fight back. Seeing as Mark has gotten considerably stronger since their last face-off, Powerplex's attacks barely hurt him. Mark finally seems to get through to him, saying that the only thing he's really guilty of is failing occasionally. Mark is a hero, and heroes don't always save everyone. He also fairly coldly but directly reminds him that it was Powerplex's decision to bring his wife and child into this, and ultimately it was his actions that caused his family to die, not Mark's. It seems to finally get through to Powerplex, and he breaks down crying. Mark apologizes and Powerplex is taken into custody, and despite him attacking Mark again, they agree that Powerplex needs more therapy as he's still a valuable hero when Mark isn't on the news, following the aftermath of some horrible, devastating event. Powerplex ends up being allowed to rejoin the Actioneers by Cecil, shown in the very next issue 82. Later in issue 93, Powerplex is part of the Actioneers squad that is sent in to repel the final Flaxian invasion of Earth. This starts in bloody London, mate. Ultimately, the heroes of Earth are successful against the Flaxians, but the events reveal a good bit about the time that Monster Girl and Robot spent living in their dimension. For more info on that, check out their videos, because that is about all for Powerplex's main series appearances. Ultimately, Powerplex ends up as a fairly tragic hero with a massive grudge that takes some tough love to work through. I like to think that he and Mark ultimately buried the hatchet, so to speak, but they never really interact again in the series past when Mark forces him to confront his own actions. I do truly think that Aaron Paul's performance as Powerplex in the series is masterful, and I can't wait to see him show up more throughout the animated series, as almost all of Scott's appearances are profoundly impactful to Mark Grayson. Thank you guys so much for checking out this video. I hope you learned a lot, and if you did, consider liking, following, subscribing, and doing all that other crap that YouTubers ask you to do. This has been Nick from Key Issue. Thanks again, and remember the motto, Powerplex over everything.